Sarah Martinez wiped the sweat from her forehead as she ladled another serving of mashed potatoes onto a soldier's tray. The mess hall buzzed with the usual chatter of hungry troops, their voices mixing with the clatter of metal trays and utensils. She had been working in the kitchen for 3 months now, keeping her head down and focusing on her job. Nobody asked questions, and she preferred it that way. The morning rush was always the busiest time. Hundreds of soldiers filed through the line, most barely glancing at the civilian staff serving their meals. Sarah moved efficiently, her practiced hands scooping portions with mechanical precision. She wore the standard kitchen uniform, a simple white shirt with sleeves rolled up to her elbows, hair tied back in a neat ponytail, and a name tag that simply read Sarah. As she worked, Sarah's mind wandered to her previous life. It felt like a different world now, one that seemed both distant and painfully close. She had made a deliberate choice to leave that chapter behind, trading combat boots for kitchen clogs, military precision for meal preparation. The transition hadn't been easy, but it was necessary. The mess hall operated like clockwork. Each staff member had their role, and Sarah had quickly found her place in the rhythm. She arrived early, stayed late, and rarely spoke unless spoken to. Her supervisors appreciated her work ethic, and her colleagues respected her quiet efficiency. Nobody suspected that the woman serving their breakfast had once carried a rifle instead of a ladle. During quieter moments, Sarah would catch herself listening to the soldiers' conversations. They talked about training exercises, deployments, and the constant challenges of military life. Their words stirred something deep inside her, memories she tried hard to suppress. The familiar sound of boots on linoleum, the sharp commands echoing through the corridors, the unmistakable energy of a military base. It all reminded her of who she used to be. But Sarah had reasons for keeping her past buried. The transition from active duty to civilian life had been more complicated than she ever imagined. The paperwork, the interviews, the constant questions about her service record, it had all become too much. When the opportunity arose to work in the mess hall, she grabbed it without hesitation. It was honest work, steady pay, and most importantly, anonymity. The kitchen supervisor, Mrs. Henderson, was a kind woman in her 50s who ran the operation with maternal efficiency. She had taken Sarah under her wing from the first day, showing her the ropes and never prying into her background. Sarah was grateful for the woman's discretion and repaid it with unwavering dedication to her duties. As the morning wore on, Sarah noticed the usual hierarchy among the diners. Junior enlisted personnel grabbed their food quickly and found tables with their peers. Non-commissioned officers moved with more authority. Their conversations centered on training schedules and equipment maintenance. Officers carried themselves differently, their bearing unmistakably command-oriented even in the casual setting of the mess hall. The kitchen staff had learned to read these subtle distinctions. They knew which officers preferred their eggs over easy, which sergeants always asked for extra bacon, and which soldiers would patiently wait for fresh coffee to be brewed. Sarah had developed her own mental catalog of preferences, though she kept these observations to herself. Near the end of the breakfast service, Sarah was refilling the serving pans when she heard Mrs. Henderson call her name. A group of senior officers had arrived for a late breakfast, and they needed additional help on the serving line. Sarah nodded and moved to the front, taking her position behind the steam tables. The officers moved through the line with practiced efficiency, making small talk about base operations and upcoming inspections. Sarah served each one professionally, maintaining the polite but distant demeanor she had perfected. She was reaching for a serving spoon when the sleeve of her uniform shirt rode up slightly, exposing a small portion of her forearm. The black ink was barely visible, just the edge of what appeared to be a tactical design. Sarah quickly adjusted her sleeve, but the movement was noticed by sharp military eyes trained to observe details. She continued serving, unaware that her carefully guarded secret had just taken its first step toward exposure. The conversation among the officers continued, but there was a subtle shift in attention. Professional military personnel were skilled at noticing inconsistencies, and something about the kitchen worker had caught someone's interest. Sarah finished her serving duties and stepped back from the line, returning to her cleaning tasks in the kitchen. As she scrubbed serving pans in the industrial sink, Sarah felt the familiar weight of scrutiny she thought she had left behind. The feeling was subtle but unmistakable, the sensation of being observed and evaluated. She forced herself to maintain her usual routine, focusing on the simple task of cleaning dishes and avoiding eye contact with anyone who might be watching. The mess hall gradually emptied as breakfast service concluded. Sarah and her colleagues began the process of cleaning and preparing for the lunch shift. The work was methodical and soothing, providing structure to her day and keeping her mind occupied. She had found comfort in these routines, the predictable nature of kitchen work offering a stark contrast to the uncertainties of her former life. But as she worked, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The carefully constructed wall she had built around her new identity felt suddenly fragile. She had been so careful, so deliberate in her efforts to blend in and remain invisible. The thought that her cover might be compromised sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the industrial air conditioning. The morning had started like any other, but Sarah sensed that her quiet anonymity might be coming to an end. She continued her work with outward calm, but inside, old instincts were beginning to stir. The soldier she had tried so hard to bury was still there, alert and ready to surface when circumstances demanded it. Colonel James Mitchell finished his breakfast with characteristic efficiency, but his mind wasn't entirely focused on the scrambled eggs and toast. Something about the kitchen worker had triggered his curiosity. With 30 years of military experience, he had developed an instinct for reading people, and the woman serving breakfast didn't quite fit the profile of a typical civilian employee. The way she moved caught his attention first. There was a precision to her movements, a controlled efficiency that spoke of military training. Civilian workers, even experienced ones, moved differently in a kitchen environment. They were focused and skilled, but they lacked the particular bearing that came from years of military discipline. The woman behind the serving line moved like a soldier trying not to move like a soldier. Mitchell had also noticed the brief glimpse of what appeared to be a tattoo on her forearm. The design was unmistakably military in style, and from his limited view, it looked like something associated with special operations units. The woman had quickly covered it, but not before his trained eye had registered the distinctive black ink pattern that spoke of elite military service. As he left the mess hall, Mitchell made a mental note to investigate further. It wasn't uncommon for veterans to find employment on military bases, but something about this particular situation felt different. The woman's obvious desire to remain unnoticed, combined with what he suspected was a special forces background, raised questions that his security-conscious mind couldn't ignore. Sarah spent the rest of the morning in the kitchen, helping prepare for the lunch service. She worked alongside Maria, a cheerful woman in her 40s who had been employed at the base for over a decade. Maria chatted constantly about her family, her weekend plans, and the latest base gossip, providing a comfortable background of normal conversation that helped Sarah maintain her civilian persona. The lunch preparation was more complex than breakfast. The menu included 3 main entrees, multiple side dishes, and dessert options that required careful coordination among the kitchen staff. Sarah found herself assigned to vegetable preparation, a task that allowed her to work with her hands while staying somewhat removed from the main serving area. As she diced carrots and celery, Sarah's mind kept returning to the morning's incident. She replayed the moment when her sleeve had ridden up, trying to remember exactly how much of her tattoo had been visible. The design was intricate and unmistakably military, a tactical symbol that would be immediately recognizable to anyone with special forces experience. The tattoo represented a part of her life she had worked hard to leave behind. It marked her as a member of an elite unit, one that had seen action in some of the most dangerous regions of the world. The ink was a badge of honor among her former colleagues, but in her current situation, it was a liability that could destroy the anonymity she had fought so hard to maintain. Mrs. Henderson approached Sarah's workstation with her usual warm smile. The supervisor was carrying a clipboard and appeared to be conducting her routine lunch preparation checklist. She paused to inspect Sarah's vegetable cutting, nodding approvingly at the consistent size and neat organization of the prepared ingredients. The 2 women worked in comfortable silence for a few minutes before Mrs. Henderson mentioned that they might be receiving some special visitors during lunch service. A group of visiting officers from another base would be touring the facilities, and the mess hall was expected to make a good impression. The news made Sarah's stomach tighten with anxiety, though she kept her expression neutral and focused on her work. Special visitors meant increased scrutiny and additional attention to details. It also meant that more senior personnel would be present during the meal service, creating additional opportunities for uncomfortable encounters. Sarah considered asking to remain in the kitchen during lunch, but such a request would seem unusual and might draw the very attention she was trying to avoid. The lunch service began with its typical organized chaos. Soldiers filed through the line in groups, their conversations creating a steady hum of background noise. Sarah took her position at the serving station, focusing on maintaining her usual professional demeanor while remaining alert to potential problems. The visiting officers arrived about 30 minutes into the service. They moved through the mess hall with the confident bearing of senior military personnel, engaging in conversations with local staff and observing operations with experienced eyes. Sarah kept her head down and concentrated on serving food, hoping to avoid any direct interaction with the visitors. Colonel Mitchell appeared in the serving line sooner than Sarah had expected. She recognized him immediately from the morning service and felt her pulse quicken as he approached her station. The colonel moved with deliberate purpose, his eyes scanning the serving area with the methodical attention of someone conducting an evaluation. When Mitchell reached Sarah's position, he paused longer than necessary while she served his meal. His gaze was direct and assessing, the look of a commanding officer studying a subordinate. Sarah maintained her professional smile and avoided eye contact, but she could feel the intensity of his scrutiny. The colonel accepted his food with a polite thank you, but instead of moving on immediately, he lingered at the station. He made casual conversation about the meal, commenting on the quality of the preparation and asking about the kitchen's daily operations. His questions were polite but probing, the kind of seemingly innocent inquiries that experienced interrogators use to gather information. Sarah answered his questions with careful neutrality, providing basic information about meal preparation while revealing nothing personal about herself. She was acutely aware that their conversation was being observed by other kitchen staff and dining personnel, adding another layer of complexity to an already delicate situation. As the colonel finally moved away from the serving line, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and concern. The encounter had been brief and outwardly professional, but she sensed that it was far from over. Colonel Mitchell had the bearing of a man who followed up on his curiosities, and Sarah suspected that her carefully maintained anonymity was about to face its greatest challenge yet. The remainder of the lunch service passed without incident, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every time she glanced toward the dining area, she expected to see the colonel's analytical gaze studying her movements. The sensation was familiar but unwelcome, reminiscent of the constant vigilance required during her military service. As the dining hall began to empty, Sarah helped with the cleanup process while mentally preparing for whatever might come next. Her instincts told her that Colonel Mitchell wasn't the type of officer to let mysteries remain unsolved, especially when they occurred within his area of responsibility. The quiet civilian life she had built for herself suddenly felt very fragile indeed. That afternoon, Colonel Mitchell sat in his office reviewing personnel files on his computer screen. The fluorescent lights hummed quietly overhead as he scrolled through employment records for the civilian staff working in the mess hall. His assistant, Sergeant Williams, had compiled the information at his request, though Mitchell had kept his reasons deliberately vague. Sarah Martinez's file was surprisingly thin. She had been hired 3 months earlier with basic references and standard background checks. Her previous employment history showed a gap of nearly 2 years before she applied for the kitchen position. The file contained her social security number, emergency contact information, and little else of substance. What the file didn't contain was equally telling. There was no mention of military service, no veterans preference documentation, and no indication of the specialized training that Mitchell was certain he had observed. Either Sarah Martinez had never served in the military, which contradicted his professional instincts, or she had deliberately omitted that information from her employment application. Mitchell leaned back in his chair and considered his options. He could conduct a more thorough background investigation, but that would require official justification and might alert Sarah to his suspicions. Alternatively, he could arrange another casual encounter and attempt to gather more information through direct observation. Meanwhile, Sarah was finishing her shift in the kitchen, helping to prepare ingredients for the next day's breakfast service. The routine tasks provided some comfort, but she remained on edge after the lunch encounter with Colonel Mitchell. She had dealt with suspicious commanding officers before, but always while wearing a uniform and protected by the clear structure of military hierarchy. As a civilian employee, Sarah occupied a different position in the base's social structure. She was outside the direct chain of command but still subject to military authority in matters of security and operations. The ambiguity of her status made her feel vulnerable in ways she hadn't experienced during active duty. Mrs. Henderson approached Sarah as she was finishing her prep work. The supervisor's expression was neutral, but there was something in her manner that suggested an important conversation was about to take place. She asked Sarah to step into the small office adjacent to the kitchen, closing the door behind them for privacy. The office was cramped and functional, with metal filing cabinets lining one wall and a desk covered in scheduling charts and supply inventories. Mrs. Henderson sat behind the desk and gestured for Sarah to take the chair opposite her. The arrangement felt uncomfortably formal, very different from their usual casual interactions. Mrs. Henderson explained that she had received an inquiry about Sarah's background from the base administration office. The request had been vague, asking for general information about her employment history and job performance. While the supervisor assured Sarah that her work had been exemplary, she wanted to give her advance warning about potential additional scrutiny. Sarah felt her stomach drop as the implications became clear. Someone in the chain of command had taken an interest in her background, and that someone had enough authority to request information through official channels. She thanked Mrs. Henderson for the warning while trying to maintain an outward appearance of calm confusion, as if she couldn't understand why anyone would be interested in a simple kitchen worker. The supervisor offered to provide a strong recommendation if Sarah needed to seek employment elsewhere, but she also made it clear that the kitchen staff was expected to cooperate fully with any official inquiries. The message was delivered with kindness but was unmistakably clear. Sarah's position depended on transparency with military authorities. After leaving Mrs. Henderson's office, Sarah gathered her personal belongings and prepared to leave the base for the day. The routine security check at the gate felt different now, as if the guards were paying closer attention to her identification and demeanor. She forced herself to maintain normal behavior while her mind raced through possible responses to her deteriorating situation. The drive home gave Sarah time to think about her limited options. She could resign her position and disappear before any investigation revealed her true background, but that would mean starting over yet again with even fewer resources. Alternatively, she could prepare to reveal selected portions of her military service while keeping the most sensitive details hidden. Sarah's apartment was a modest one-bedroom unit in a complex popular with military families and base employees. She had furnished it simply and lived there quietly, avoiding close relationships with neighbors who might ask too many questions about her past. The space felt like a safe haven, but she knew that safety could be an illusion if the wrong people became interested in her story. That evening, Sarah sat at her small kitchen table and considered her next moves. She opened a laptop computer and began researching Colonel Mitchell's background, using publicly available information to understand what kind of officer she was dealing with. His service record was impressive and included multiple combat deployments and leadership positions in high-stress environments. The colonel's background suggested that he was not the type of officer who would lose interest in a mystery without finding answers. His experience with special operations units meant that he would likely recognize the significance of any military tattoos he might have glimpsed. Sarah realized that her attempt to hide in plain sight had probably already failed. As she prepared for bed, Sarah made a difficult decision. Rather than waiting for the investigation to reveal her secrets, she would take control of the situation by approaching Colonel Mitchell directly. It was a risky strategy that could backfire spectacularly, but it offered the possibility of managing the revelation of her background on her own terms. The decision brought Sarah both relief and terror. She had spent months building a new identity as a civilian employee, but that identity was proving impossible to maintain under military scrutiny. Perhaps it was time to stop running from her past and find a way to reconcile her former and current selves. She set her alarm for an earlier time than usual, planning to arrive at the base before her normal shift began. If she was going to have a conversation with Colonel Mitchell, She wanted to do it on her own initiative rather than waiting to be summoned for questioning. The anticipation of the encounter made sleep difficult, but Sarah had learned to function on minimal rest during her military service. Tomorrow would bring either disaster or the beginning of a new chapter in her complicated relationship with military life. As she lay in the darkness, Sarah found herself thinking about the tattoo that had started this chain of events. The design represented brotherhood, sacrifice, and shared experiences that had shaped her identity in ways she was still learning to understand. The irony wasn't lost on her that the mark she had received as a symbol of belonging had become the thing that threatened to destroy the anonymity she had worked so hard to achieve. But maybe anonymity wasn't what she really needed after all. Sarah arrived at the base an hour before her scheduled shift, her heart pounding as she passed through the security checkpoint. The morning air was crisp, and the base was quieter than usual with only essential personnel moving between buildings. She had rehearsed possible conversations during her sleepless night, but none of her mental preparations felt adequate for what she was about to attempt. The administrative building housing Colonel Mitchell's office was a two-story structure with the sterile efficiency typical of military facilities. Sarah approached the receptionist's desk with carefully controlled confidence, requesting a brief meeting with the colonel regarding a personnel matter. The young corporal behind the desk looked surprised but made a phone call to verify the colonel's availability. Colonel Mitchell agreed to see her immediately, which Sarah interpreted as confirmation that he had been expecting some kind of follow-up to their previous encounters. She was escorted down a hallway lined with official photographs and commendation displays past offices where the early shift was beginning their daily routines. The colonel's office was larger than Sarah had expected, with windows overlooking the main parade ground and walls decorated with military memorabilia from various deployments. Mitchell stood as she entered, gesturing for her to take a seat across from his desk. His manner was professional but curious, the bearing of an officer accustomed to unusual situations. Sarah had decided on a strategy of controlled honesty. She would reveal enough of her background to satisfy the colonel's curiosity while keeping the most sensitive details of her service record private. It was a delicate balance that required careful attention to his reactions and questions. She began by acknowledging that she had served in the military before taking her current position in the mess hall. The statement was delivered matter-of-factly, without apology or elaborate explanation. Sarah watched Mitchell's expression carefully, looking for signs of whether this admission was sufficient or if he would press for more specific information. The colonel leaned back in his chair and studied Sarah with the analytical gaze she remembered from their previous encounters. He asked direct questions about her branch of service, length of enlistment, and reasons for leaving the military. His questions were professional but probing, designed to gather information while establishing the parameters of their conversation. Sarah answered truthfully about her service in the Army, providing basic information about her military occupational specialty and deployment history. She described her role in general terms, identifying herself as having served in a support capacity without mentioning the specialized nature of her actual duties. The partial truth felt uncomfortable, but it was necessary for maintaining her privacy. Mitchell's questions became more specific as the conversation continued. He asked about her tattoo, having clearly observed more detail than Sarah had hoped during their encounters in the mess hall. She acknowledged that the design represented her unit affiliation, but deflected questions about specific operations or classified activities with references to security protocols and non-disclosure agreements. The colonel's experience with special operations personnel was evident in his questioning technique. He didn't push for information that Sarah was obviously reluctant to provide, but he established clearly that he understood the significance of her background. His approach was respectful but firm, acknowledging her right to privacy while making clear his responsibility for base security. Sarah found herself appreciating Mitchell's professionalism, even as she worried about the implications of their conversation. He treated her as a fellow veteran rather than a subordinate employee, recognizing the complexities of her situation without making assumptions about her motivations. The respect was something she hadn't experienced since leaving active duty. The discussion turned to Sarah's current employment and her reasons for seeking work in the mess hall. She explained honestly about the challenges of transitioning to civilian life, and her desire to find stable employment in a familiar environment. The base offered structure and purpose without the intense pressures of her former military role. Mitchell listened without interruption as Sarah described her efforts to build a new life while processing the experiences of her military service. She didn't go into detail about specific events or operations, but she conveyed the general challenges faced by veterans adjusting to civilian careers. Her words carried the weight of authentic experience that couldn't be fabricated. The colonel acknowledged the difficulties many veterans face during transition and expressed appreciation for her service, regardless of the specific details she chose not to share. His response suggested that he understood the need for privacy around certain military experiences, while recognizing the value of her background and skills. As their conversation continued, Sarah began to sense that Mitchell's interest might extend beyond simple security concerns. He asked about her impressions of the base's operations and whether she had observations about efficiency improvements or potential problems. The question suggested that he saw her veteran's perspective as potentially valuable rather than merely suspicious. Sarah offered some general observations about mess hall operations and staff management, drawing on her leadership experience without revealing the extent of her military training. She found herself engaging more naturally in the conversation as it shifted from interrogation to consultation, remembering how much she had enjoyed problem-solving and operational planning during her service. The meeting concluded with Mitchell expressing appreciation for her honesty and professionalism. He made clear that her military background was not a problem for her current employment, but he also established that any future issues requiring security clearance or detailed background information would need to be addressed through official channels. Sarah left the colonel's office feeling cautiously relieved. The conversation had gone better than she had feared, and Mitchell's respectful approach had reminded her of positive aspects of military culture that she had missed during her civilian transition. She still had her job, and more importantly, she no longer had to worry about hiding her veteran status from her supervisor. However, Sarah also recognized that the meeting had fundamentally changed her position on the base. She was no longer an anonymous civilian employee but a known veteran with an acknowledged special operations background. The change brought both opportunities and complications that she would need to navigate carefully. As she walked back to the mess hall to begin her regular shift, Sarah reflected on how the morning's events had forced her to confront aspects of her identity that she had tried to suppress. The conversation with Colonel Mitchell had reminded her that her military experience was part of who she was, not something to be ashamed of or hidden away. The kitchen staff noticed her slightly late arrival but didn't comment on her absence. Mrs. Henderson gave her a questioning look that suggested curiosity about her early morning activities, but respected Sarah's privacy by not asking for details. The normal routine of breakfast preparation provided a welcome return to familiar tasks after the intensity of her meeting with the colonel. As Sarah resumed her duties, she found herself wondering what changes this revelation might bring to her carefully structured life. The conversation with Mitchell had opened a door that she had worked hard to keep closed. But perhaps it was time to stop running from her past and find a way to integrate her military experience with her civilian aspirations. Over the following week, Sarah noticed subtle changes in how she was perceived and treated on the base. Word had apparently spread through unofficial channels that the quiet kitchen worker had military experience, though the specific details remained unknown to most personnel. The change in atmosphere was neither positive nor negative, but it was unmistakably different. Some of the younger soldiers began showing her additional respect during meal service, the kind of deference typically reserved for senior enlisted personnel or officers. They seemed to sense that Sarah possessed experience and knowledge that went beyond food preparation, though they couldn't articulate exactly what they perceived. Mrs. Henderson approached Sarah with increasing frequency for advice on managing kitchen operations and personnel issues. The supervisor seemed to recognize that her employee brought leadership skills to situations that went beyond the requirements of her job description. Sarah found herself naturally falling into an advisory role, offering suggestions based on her military experience with team management and operational efficiency. Colonel Mitchell began appearing in the mess hall more regularly, always maintaining professional boundaries but clearly observing Sarah's interactions with staff and diners. His presence wasn't intrusive, but it served as a reminder that her background remained a subject of interest to the base command structure. The increased attention made Sarah uncomfortable at times, but she also found herself missing the sense of purpose and responsibility that had defined her military career. Working in the kitchen was honest employment, but it didn't challenge her intellect or utilize the skills she had developed through years of specialized training and combat experience. One morning, Mrs. Henderson asked Sarah to stay after her shift for a private conversation. The supervisor's expression was serious but not unfriendly, suggesting an important discussion rather than disciplinary action. Sarah agreed, curious about what might have prompted the request for a meeting. In the privacy of the office, Mrs. Henderson revealed that she had been approached by base administration about Sarah's potential interest in additional responsibilities. The base was implementing new efficiency protocols for food service operations, and they needed someone with both practical kitchen experience and leadership background to help with the transition. The position would involve training staff on new procedures, coordinating with different departments, and ensuring smooth implementation of updated protocols. It was essentially a supervisory role that would utilize Sarah's military experience while keeping her within the familiar environment of food service operations. Sarah was surprised by the offer and asked for time to consider her response. The opportunity represented a significant change from her current anonymity, but it also offered the chance to use her skills in a meaningful way. She would need to weigh the benefits of increased responsibility against her desire to maintain a low profile. That evening, Sarah reflected on how dramatically her situation had changed since Colonel Mitchell first noticed her tattoo. What had begun as a threat to her carefully constructed civilian identity had evolved into an opportunity for professional advancement. The irony wasn't lost on her that trying to hide her military background had ultimately led to its discovery and recognition. She realized that her attempt to completely separate her civilian and military identities had been both unrealistic and unnecessary. Her service experience was part of who she was, and denying that aspect of herself had created more problems than it solved. Perhaps the challenge wasn't hiding her past, but learning to integrate it productively with her present circumstances. The next morning, Sarah informed Mrs. Henderson that she was interested in learning more about the supervisory position. She requested details about the scope of responsibilities, reporting structure, and timeline for implementation. Her questions were thorough and professional, reflecting the analytical approach she had learned during military planning sessions. Mrs. Henderson seemed pleased by Sarah's interest and arranged a meeting with the base's food service coordinator to discuss specifics. The coordinator was a civilian contractor with extensive experience managing military dining operations, and she appreciated Sarah's unique combination of kitchen skills and leadership background. During their discussion, Sarah learned that the new position would involve significant interaction with various base departments, requiring her to rebuild professional relationships that extended beyond the kitchen staff. The role would make her more visible within the base community, effectively ending her period of anonymous civilian employment. The coordinator also mentioned that the position might eventually lead to opportunities for additional training and certification in food service management. Such credentials could open doors to supervisory roles at other military installations or in civilian food service organizations, providing long-term career prospects that Sarah hadn't previously considered. As the conversation progressed, Sarah found herself becoming genuinely excited about the professional challenges the position would present. The work would require problem-solving skills, personnel management, and operational planning, all areas where her military experience provided valuable preparation. She began to see the opportunity as a bridge between her past and future, rather than a compromise of her civilian goals. Colonel Mitchell appeared at the mess hall during lunch service later that week, but this time his visit seemed more purposeful than observational. He approached Sarah directly and asked if they could have a brief conversation after her shift ended. His manner was professional but suggested that he had specific matters to discuss. Their second meeting in his office was markedly different from their first encounter. Mitchell congratulated Sarah on her selection for the supervisory position and expressed confidence that her military background would serve her well in the new role. He also shared information about additional opportunities that might become available for qualified personnel with her experience and clearance level. The colonel explained that the base periodically needed civilian contractors for specialized projects that required both military experience and security clearance. These assignments were typically short-term, but offered excellent compensation and the chance to utilize advanced skills in meaningful work. Sarah would be added to a list of qualified personnel who could be contacted when appropriate. Opportunities arose. Sarah was intrigued by the possibilities Mitchell described, but also cautious about becoming too deeply involved in military operations again. She had left active duty for specific reasons, and she needed to ensure that any future commitments wouldn't recreate the problems that had driven her to seek civilian employment. The colonel seemed to understand her concerns and assured her that any participation in special projects would be entirely voluntary. The arrangements would be structured as civilian contracting relationships rather than military assignments, providing clear boundaries and specific term limits for any work performed. As Sarah left Mitchell's office for the second time, she felt a sense of cautious optimism about her future prospects. The conversation had reinforced her growing belief that she didn't need to choose between her military experience and civilian aspirations. Instead, she could find ways to honor both aspects of her identity while building a career that utilized her unique qualifications. The transformation from anonymous kitchen worker to recognized veteran with leadership responsibilities represented a fundamental shift in how Sarah saw herself and her place in the world. The change hadn't been easy or comfortable, but it had opened possibilities that she was only beginning to explore and understand. Sarah's transition into her new supervisory role began with a comprehensive orientation program designed to familiarize her with base-wide food service operations. She spent her first week visiting different facilities, meeting department heads, and reviewing operational protocols that extended far beyond the single mess hall where she had previously worked. The scope of responsibility was larger than she had initially understood. The base maintained multiple dining facilities, each with specific requirements based on their location and the personnel they served. Officer clubs, training facilities, and specialized units all had different operational needs that required coordination and oversight. Sarah found herself drawing heavily on her military experience as she learned to navigate the complex relationships between various base departments. Supply logistics, personnel scheduling, and budget management were all familiar challenges from her previous service, though the specific context of food service operations required new applications of established skills. Her military background proved particularly valuable when dealing with the inevitable problems that arose in large-scale operations. Equipment failures, supply shortages, and staffing issues required quick decision-making and creative problem-solving skills that Sarah had developed during combat deployments where improvisation often meant the difference between mission success and failure. The kitchen staff responded positively to Sarah's leadership style, which emphasized clear communication, mutual respect, and shared responsibility for operational success. Her approach was firm but fair, holding people accountable for their performance while providing support and training to help them improve their skills. Mrs. Henderson remained as the senior supervisor, but she increasingly relied on Sarah to handle complex operational issues and staff management challenges. The working relationship between the two women evolved into an effective partnership that combined Henderson's institutional knowledge with Sarah's analytical approach to problem-solving. Colonel Mitchell continued to monitor Sarah's progress through informal conversations and periodic visits to the dining facilities. His interest seemed genuinely supportive rather than suspicious, and he occasionally sought her opinions on base operations that extended beyond food service. These consultations reminded Sarah of the collaborative relationship she had enjoyed with fellow officers during her military service. 3 months into her new position, Sarah faced her first major crisis when a critical equipment failure threatened to shut down the main dining facility during a period of increased base activity. Multiple units were conducting training exercises, and the facility needed to serve nearly double its normal capacity while operating with reduced cooking capability. Sarah's response to the crisis demonstrated the full extent of her leadership capabilities. She coordinated with base maintenance to expedite equipment repairs, arranged for temporary cooking equipment from other facilities, and reorganized staff schedules to ensure adequate coverage during peak meal periods. Her calm efficiency under pressure impressed both her civilian colleagues and military observers. The successful management of the crisis led to increased confidence from base administration and expanded responsibilities for Sarah's position. She was invited to participate in planning meetings for special events, facility upgrades, and operational improvements that would have been beyond the scope of her original job description. Sarah also began receiving informal requests for advice from other departments facing logistical challenges. Her reputation as an effective problem solver spread through the base's informal communication networks, leading to consultations on issues ranging from supply chain management to personnel training protocols. The increased visibility brought both opportunities and challenges that Sarah hadn't anticipated. While she appreciated the professional recognition and the chance to utilize her skills more fully, she also found herself navigating complex relationships with military personnel who were curious about her background but respectful of her privacy. Some officers began approaching her with questions that went beyond food service operations, seeking advice on leadership challenges and operational planning issues. These conversations reminded Sarah of the collaborative environment she had missed since leaving active duty, but they also required careful attention to boundaries and security considerations. The base commander, General Patricia Walsh, took notice of Sarah's contributions during a monthly briefing where department heads discussed operational improvements. Colonel Mitchell had mentioned Sarah's crisis management during the equipment failure, highlighting her ability to coordinate multiple departments under pressure while maintaining service quality. General Walsh requested a private meeting with Sarah to discuss her background and potential for additional responsibilities. The meeting was scheduled for the following week, giving Sarah time to consider how much detail she was willing to share about her military service and what kind of future commitments she might be prepared to accept. Sarah spent considerable time preparing for the meeting with General Walsh, reviewing her thoughts about the direction her career was taking and the balance she wanted to maintain between military involvement and civilian independence. The opportunity to work directly with senior leadership was both exciting and concerning. Given her reasons for leaving active duty, the conversation with the general proved to be more comfortable than Sarah had expected. Walsh was a seasoned officer who understood the complexities of military to civilian transitions and the value of diverse perspectives in base operations. She didn't pressure Sarah for details about her classified service history, but made clear that her contributions were valued and would be supported. General Walsh offered Sarah the opportunity to participate in a pilot program designed to improve coordination between civilian contractors and military personnel. The program would involve working with various departments to identify operational inefficiencies and develop solutions that utilized both military structure and civilian innovation. The position would be a significant step up in responsibility and visibility, essentially making Sarah a liaison between the civilian workforce and military command structure. It was exactly the kind of challenging, meaningful work that had attracted her to military service originally, but structured in a way that maintained her civilian status and independence. Sarah requested time to consider the offer, explaining that she wanted to ensure she could meet the expectations of such an important role while maintaining the work-life balance she had established since leaving active duty. General Walsh appreciated her thoughtful approach and agreed to give her a week to reach a decision. That evening, Sarah reflected on the remarkable journey from anonymous kitchen worker to potential senior civilian advisor. The path had been unexpected and sometimes uncomfortable, but it had led to opportunities that honored both her military experience and her civilian aspirations. She realized that her attempts to hide her background had actually prevented her from finding the meaningful work that her skills and experience had prepared her to handle. The decision about General Walsh's offer would determine the next phase of Sarah's career and her relationship with military life. She had proven to herself and others that she could successfully bridge the gap between her past and present. But the question remained whether she was ready to take on even greater responsibilities and visibility. As she considered her options, Sarah understood that accepting the position would mean fully embracing her identity as a veteran with valuable skills, rather than continuing to minimize that aspect of her background. The transformation that had begun with a glimpse of her tattoo was approaching a conclusion that would define her future in ways she was still learning to understand. Sarah spent the week carefully weighing General Walsh's offer, consulting with trusted friends and mentors who could help her evaluate the long-term implications of such a significant career decision. She spoke with Mrs. Henderson, who encouraged her to pursue opportunities that would utilize her full potential, and with a former military colleague who helped her think through the practical aspects of working closely with senior military leadership again. The decision ultimately came down to whether Sarah was ready to fully integrate her military experience with her civilian career goals. The position offered everything she had valued about military service: meaningful work, clear purpose, and the opportunity to make a positive impact while maintaining the independence and flexibility she had sought in civilian life. Sarah scheduled a meeting with General Walsh to accept the position, but with specific conditions that would protect her work-life balance and maintain clear boundaries around her involvement in classified operations. The general was receptive to her requests and worked with her to structure the role in a way that met both her needs and the base's operational requirements. The announcement of Sarah's appointment as civilian military liaison coordinator was met with widespread approval from both military personnel and civilian staff. Her reputation for effective problem-solving and fair treatment of all personnel had earned respect across the base community, making her a natural choice for a position that required building bridges between different groups. Colonel Mitchell was among the first to congratulate Sarah on her appointment, acknowledging that his initial curiosity about her background had led to positive outcomes for everyone involved. He admitted that he had suspected she possessed leadership capabilities that were being underutilized in the kitchen, but he hadn't anticipated the extent of her qualifications or the impact she would have on base operations. Sarah's first major project in her new role involved developing a comprehensive review of base services and identifying opportunities for improved coordination between military and civilian personnel. The work required her to interview staff at all levels, analyze operational data, and develop recommendations that balanced efficiency with the human factors that affected morale and job satisfaction. The project allowed Sarah to utilize skills she had developed during military intelligence analysis while applying them to the civilian context she had come to appreciate. She found herself energized by the intellectual challenges and the opportunity to make meaningful improvements to people's daily work experiences. Her recommendations included several innovative approaches to staff training, cross-departmental communication, and resource allocation that impressed senior leadership and led to immediate implementation of pilot programs. The success of these initiatives established Sarah's credibility as a strategic thinker and effective change agent. 6 months into her new position, Sarah received a letter from a former military colleague who had heard about her work through professional networks. The letter praised her for finding a way to continue serving while maintaining her civilian independence, noting that her example had inspired other veterans to seek similar opportunities that honored their military experience while supporting their post-service goals. The recognition from her former colleagues meant more to Sarah than any official commendation, confirming that she had successfully navigated the difficult transition from military to civilian life while finding work that truly utilized her capabilities and training. She had proven that veterans could contribute meaningfully to military operations without sacrificing the independence and flexibility that civilian careers could provide. As Sarah looked back on the journey that had brought her from hiding her military background to openly utilizing it in service of others, she realized that the colonel's observation of her tattoo had been the catalyst for positive changes she couldn't have imagined. What had initially seemed like a threat to her carefully constructed civilian identity had actually led to opportunities that honored all aspects of her experience and capabilities. The base had become a different place for Sarah, transformed from a location where she had sought anonymity into a community where she was valued for her unique combination of military experience and civilian perspective. She had found a way to serve that aligned with her personal values while contributing to the larger mission of supporting military personnel and their families. Mrs. Henderson, now serving as Sarah's deputy and coordinating civilian staff operations, often remarked on the remarkable transformation she had witnessed. The quiet, efficient kitchen worker who had preferred to remain unnoticed had evolved into a confident leader whose insights were sought by personnel at all levels of the organization. Sarah's story had become something of a legend on the base, demonstrating that second chances and new beginnings were possible for veterans willing to embrace both their past experience and their future potential. Her success encouraged other veterans working in civilian positions to be more open about their military backgrounds and to seek opportunities that fully utilize their skills and training. The tattoo that had once threatened to expose her carefully guarded secrets had become a symbol of pride and professional accomplishment. Sarah no longer felt the need to hide the mark that represented her military service, understanding that her experience was an asset rather than a liability in building the career and life she truly wanted. On quiet evenings, Sarah would sometimes reflect on the unexpected path that had led from serving meals in anonymity to coordinating complex operations that affected hundreds of people daily. The journey had taught her that running from the past was less effective than learning to integrate all aspects of her identity into a coherent and fulfilling future. She had discovered that the skills and experiences that defined her military service could enhance rather than compromise her civilian aspirations, creating opportunities that honored both her service to country and her personal growth as an individual.